I think people were hoping AI would be different here because Sam Altman, the CEO, has sometimes lambasted ads in the past. There's this relatively famous quote where he says, "I will disclose just as a personal bias that I hate ads." It wasn't that long ago, but clearly times have changed.
It's not looking so good for Sam.
And welcome back to the Pre-Trained Pod. I'm Pierce Freeman, AI founder based in San Francisco, where I've built and sold multiple AI startups.
Hey guys, it's Rich. I'm a research scientist in the Bay Area.
All right, Rich. Well, we're going to be covering OpenAI's new ad platform, OpenClaw joining forces with OpenAI, a couple of two open companies joining one another, Waymo's new world model, a new speech-to-text model in town, and the arms race of new versions of Codex and Opus.
Hell yeah, dude.
Okay, Rich. The day of reckoning has finally come. OpenAI announced that they're bringing advertising to ChatGPT. They published a blog post. As far as I know, it's not live yet, but there's a blog post establishing a set of principles where they discuss how ads will work. You know, they're trying to justify it to themselves as well as to us. Obviously, online advertising has been the default monetization model for free consumer internet products since Google proved it out 2 or 3 decades ago. So in some ways, this is not surprising. I think people were hoping AI would be different here because Sam Altman, the CEO, has sometimes lambasted ads in the past. There's this relatively famous quote from, I think, some fireside chat at Harvard where he says, "I will disclose just as a personal bias that I hate ads." I think ads were important to give the early internet business model, but they do sort of somewhat fundamentally misalign users' incentives with the company providing the service.
Do you know when he said this? Was this recent?
This was like 2024.
Ooh,
Yes.
okay.
So it wasn't that long ago, but clearly times have changed.
It's not looking so good for Sam.
I think ads needed to happen on the internet for a bunch of reasons to get it going. But I like that people pay for ChatGPT and know that the answers they're getting are not influenced by advertisers.
Yeah. So anyway, OpenAI now has finally made that pivot. They insist that ads will never touch the quality of ChatGPT's answers. So right now, it's kind of this separate pill box that they just put on the bottom that people can click on if they want to consume it. And it's only for some of their account plans, the free and then this Go plan, which is a little bit cheaper. Richard, do you buy the claim that you can run ads in an AI assistant without it eventually compromising the responses?
Eventually, no, probably not. I think in the short term, you can probably get away with it. But I mean, think about it, man. Like, as soon as you have an ad running in the actual context as your conversation, surely like the next step is for the model to ingest that ad and condition its subsequent responses on that ad itself, right?
So that you can interact with the ad.
So that you can interact with it,
right?
Like, what would the user experience be like of getting an ad served and then saying, "Oh yeah, well, let me actually buy this"? At that point, the model has to actually have some notion of what ad it served you, has to condition its response on that ad, and then has to action on its understanding of that ad, right? I don't think you can separate these two things out cleanly. I think fundamentally, as soon as the model is serving you an ad, it has to be aware of the ad that you were served. So I don't really know how you would even go about that in the first place.
I think the way that they're doing right now is probably a meta model on top of the conversation itself. So if you send it a message, at least how I would implement it would be like 2 branching paths where you do the regular LLM prediction response, like it's always been on ChatGPT. And then the other pipeline is saying, let's take the test, do some embedding, and then try to put that embedding into our ad network layer to find who is bidding on a similar topic to what you're talking about. So like if you're asking for what's a recipe for, chicken parm, then it would say, okay, you're talking about food, groceries, going to put in a grocery ad. And then they just show that within this pill. I think that's how they're doing it today. But I think the question that you're asking is basically like, okay, that works if you're looking at it on a screen on ChatGPT. But like the second that we're talking about a voice model and I can only interact with it via speech, like it's going to have to say the ad and then probably let me address it in response. So like it gets muddy very fast.
I think I more and more have become a UX guy first and then a language modeling person second. I think fundamentally, the thing that differentiates different language models from each other is the user experience that you have with them. Like all these language models fundamentally are basically backed by the same tech, right? I think what differentiates certain companies from each other is how they present to you that language model. And I think increasingly, Claude, for instance, is putting more emphasis on the Claude co-work kind of aspect of it The idea being that you don't just interact with this model in a chat interface, you're actually doing some collaborative like process with the model, right? And it's kind of running in the background.
This is like Claude Cowork, Claude Code,
Exactly.
whatever.
And I mean, like the whole new like frontier of language models at this point is exploring how can you interact with a user base in a way that isn't a chat interface? Like, what does that user experience actually look like? And to me, the question then it becomes, in that paradigm, as we move away from a chat interface towards things like Cowork, towards things like voice, like you just said, what does serving an ad there even look like? Because you can imagine a world in which maybe you're co-working with Claude or with chat. It realizes that as part of this conversation, in order to solve your request, it would actually be super convenient to order something from Amazon for you. Maybe the right user experience there is for Claude to just say, hey, Pierce, I think what you really need at this point is a new modem, let's just say, right? In order to build out this web app. Is it okay with you if I recommend automatically one for you? And by the way, I have your credit card on file. Can I just order it for you? Is that okay? At that point, they're serving an ad feels like a different thing, right? How do you tell the user that this is a Claude recommendation versus that this is a Claude ad recommendation? What does that look like? That is where it gets tricky. And that I think is actually the frontier that we're working towards. I think this like first approach that chat is doing here with serving that as a pill, as like a pill in the conversation window is in some sense a remnant of how Google serves ads. It is the current sort of like paradigm for serving ads that we're familiar with. But I think very, very soon, maybe call it in the next like 2 to 5 years, we're going to have to redesign and rethink what serving an ad actually looks like to begin with. Right?
Yeah. And certainly that will behoove the companies. Like I imagine they want an MVP that both we can be pretty familiar with because we're habituated to it via the way that Google does it. But I also think that speaks to the publisher side of the ad ecosystem as well, where they're used to creating ads like that. You know what I mean? Like the way that most of these ad platforms work right now is they have some management interface where you can add an ad on the publisher side of things. So like if you're selling some product, and basically whether you upload it to Meta or Amazon or Nextdoor or whatever, it's all the same thing. Like you give it some asset, you can run some tests on it, you can run some campaigns, and then you get results back that show you, okay, given this ad spend, here's how many new users or products I sold.
Yeah, the analytics are great.
The analysts are fantastic. But I think the second that you start talking about what does ChatGPT look like, if you're introducing some of these more complicated patterns, it kind of requires the publishers themselves to relearn what kind of materials do they upload? Do they have to increase more modalities and more descriptions of their products to like give this priming? Like it becomes this whole other paradigm. And it feels like right now what OpenAI is really trying to prove out is saying, let's hold all these variables constant. Let's get publishers just comfortable with our user base and see how our users interact with these ads once we're showing them in a very Google-like way.
I think that's right. And I think the big question here is going to be the same problem fundamentally that Google had initially, which was like, as soon as I see something being an ad, then I feel like this isn't really the truth anymore. This is just people trying to sell me something. And people were kind of like fundamentally concerned that this would destroy Google. I was listening to, what do they call the decoder folks? And they were kind of going through a whole, history of Google. And this was like one of the big sort of like linchpin moments that Google had to decide, like, how do they serve ads? So I think you're right. I think OpenAI right now is at that same sort of like crux point where they have to redesign the experience of what it means to serve an ad in the context of AI and whether users would even have any appetite for it to begin with. I think it's interesting here that they're starting with the free tier of the model. I mean, obviously that makes sense that you would have to figure out some way to commercialize the model to folks who aren't actually paying for access to the model to begin with. But maybe there is, some sense in which you have to think about, is there a certain like use case for which ads are most appropriate to begin with? And so OpenAI has said, we're going to double down on the shopping use case because that is like the most natural starting point. So if someone's looking up, hey, I want to buy some shoes, then serve an ad for
they're
shoes.
probably okay with an ad for shoes.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. The question here is though, are people using chat to buy shoes to begin with, right? Is that actually the experience that people have with chat most of the time? Or are they going to Google if they actually have the intention to buy something?
Yeah,
And
totally.
and for that, like, you really have to do a lot of like market research to determine how are people actually shopping for stuff to begin with, right?
I think it speaks to this one thing that people do very much use ChatGPT for right now, which is like recommendations for products. But I have actually always thought this to be like pretty funny of a use case that people will do, where I almost get the sense that when you're trying to make some decision about things that are more or less the same, but there are subtle differences between them. This is true if you're looking for software. It's true if you're looking at shoes. I've seen a habit in myself as well as I've very much seen in other people where like you'll just ask ChatGPT what is the best product for this thing. And we talked maybe last month or a couple months ago about the experience that Chat is trying to add for that shopping case, where it shows you these cards that say, okay, well, do you care about the leather that's in the shoe? Do you want it to be a red shoe versus a white shoe? What's your color profile? Like it tries to kind of quantify what is the best to you. But I think it kind of resounds the same thing, which is people are relying on Chat to have some objective sense of what is the best product out in the world there for me at this point. And that itself is not a very well scoped question to ask a language model, period, right? Like even if it has access to all of the information, even if it's as close to an oracle as possible by scanning the internet, it does feel like even when you don't talk about advertising, you open yourself up to so much prompt hijacking of companies that are trying to like trick these systems to recommending their product over other ones. There's this whole growing industry of generative engine optimization, GEO.
Is this like SEO for
exactly? It's
for
like
AI?
new aged SEO to try to like convince Chat and Claude to recommend your product over other ones. And we're still in the early days of people figuring out how to hijack these systems like this, but it does feel like this very complicated combination of these systems are way more steerable to outputs than conventional information retrieval systems have been. And then you also couple advertising on top of that, so people can maybe pay to encourage the model to push things in one direction or the other. I do get a little concerned when I think of the use case that you just mentioned. Like, I have some very generic task that I am telling my agent to go out and execute, and it's coming back to me with recommendations of where I'm going to spend my money. I could see a lot of people being down for that and actually following along. But like, I don't know if you're expecting to get the best output out of the system just based on like some generic input you give it. I almost think that these systems aren't really capable of doing that in a kind of objective way.
So there's basically two things, right? I think that the folks that, and this is coming back to my earlier point, I think that Chat has to be really careful with who the first user base is that they want to expose ads to. Because I think you're right that the shopping use case is obvious, but the users using the shopping use case might not be the best user base. I think, on the other hand, that if you're using Claude Code, the folks that are using Claude Code, and me included, have a tendency to just want to auto accept a lot of the edits that are coming from Claude. I'll find myself often in this kind of like loop when I'm interacting with Claude, where I'll just say, yes, 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 yes.
This is like the original Andre Karpathy notion of vibe coding, basically, of like,
as just like a first pass. Yeah, I'll just accept stuff until I have like a working prototype. And if I put myself in a position where I am using Claude Code and I get served an ad because it says, hey, this thing will make your code a little bit more productive and it only costs $1, I think that I would say yes in that case. I would say, okay, screw it. Let's just get this first MVP out of the door. I'm already paying something like $20 for Claude. What's another $1 if it really promises that, if Claude is telling me, hey, if you spend this $1, this is actually going to make this thing much more productive.
Totally.
I think I would just auto accept yes, because I'm in that mental framework
of like, I just got to get this done.
I just got to get this done.
Well, we're going to talk about actually fast Claude later, where we'll put you to the test on that. But yeah.
But what I'm saying here is like, there is the use case, shopping, right? Claude Code, blah, blah, blah. There's also the user base. And I think you have to really inspect like who the users are that are using these different use cases and determine what is their propensity to want to accept an ad, right? And I kind of feel like the folks using ChatGPT for shopping, even though the use case might be obvious, like a good placement for ads, I actually don't think that the user base is necessarily the right one you want to target initially.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I agree with you that there's an inherent conflict to some extent of people spending money with the promise of getting something and people spending money with potentially the promise of more revenue. And like, I've seen myself, it's slightly different because I sell to businesses, but promising people increased revenue, you'll always have an easier time making a sale than promising people decreased cost, even if it's the same net gain. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like even if
totally.
their profit goes up by the same amount, people are way more focused on this promise of riches, like increasing the bottom line versus trying to like cut on costs. And I think there's some truth to consumers in that too. Like a lot of people use these systems so aggressively. Certainly the power users of these systems use them because they're trying to get some real world tangible output. They're trying to like become smarter,
Yep.
Increase life revenue perhaps, or they're trying to like build some product or whatever. And like that's a very easy thing where you say, if you charge this much, I'll actually go out and do it. The shopping use case I think of as a little bit more like, usually when advertisers are actually going out and trying to think about campaigns, they'll separate out like brand campaigns from actual intent campaigns. And sometimes you'll bid on different keywords for both of them. Where if you end up saying,
And what does an intent campaign look like?
yeah, so an intent campaign would basically be if you're Google searching and saying buy red shoes. That's a high intent signal.
Because the person wants to do it clearly.
And they probably want to do it right now. Just searching red shoes actually is not as high intent of a campaign because you don't have the combination with your buyer intent, which is the buy. So it's like, you might want to research red shoes, or you might want to just see how red would look like on your Pinterest board. There's so many reasons. The second you can really narrow it down to the intent that people want to do, usually those ad campaigns will go through the roof in terms of the cost because you're bidding against everyone else that is also selling red shoes at the same time. So I think in ChatGPT's case, the question is, if you hone into this area of what are people trying to sell, and then like what are the buyers in this market that are trying to target those people, are we able to extract that like really key intent signal from ChatGPT? If so, we expect that this will be like incredibly profitable and there will be a ton of different ad buyers. But like if for whatever reason, the people that are doing this research, you can't really tie that with a buyer intent, I think you're going to see a much weaker ad market for people.
I 100% agree. And I just had this dystopian thought that kind of occurred to me as we were speaking, which is like, what does this look like in a world where the agentic workflow really takes over? So the agentic paradigm is every user, rather than just interacting with chat via one LLM, now is basically interacting with a suite of models that are all simultaneously working with the user, right? So in the case of Claude Cowork, there's this notion that you can have a main process and then you spin up like 100 different sub-agents that are helping you perform the task that you want, right? But you can imagine a world, and I think we're slowly approaching this world where sub-agents are talking to each other via some protocol, like a model context protocol. And there you can imagine that sub-agents might actually be trying to convince each other of ads, right?
Yeah,
Where
sure.
sub-agents are kind of trying to sell each other ads and say, hey, like...
Or like, I'm trying to buy this as a sub-agent. The other one's like, but our budget is only $100. Like, let's buy this thing
Exactly.
instead.
What does that look like, right? And imagine that a world in which the tasks that you are instructing Claude to solve or chat are these really high open-ended questions like, hey, I want to come out with a new product that does this and this thing. Do it for me, right? And this might be like a week-long task that is running on some server somewhere, performing all these computations for you. At that point, there's a good chance that at some part of the pipeline, you might want to purchase something. At that point, agents will be interacting with other agents, trying to sell this one agent something. We're going to need to figure out, what does that even look like, right? What does like inter-agent sort of commerce look like? How do agents sell things to each other?
Are these agents going to get UBI? Like there's so many.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right.
I'm kidding. I don't think that's a good idea. One thing that I just want to point out, Rich, and this blog is super brief. We'll see how this actually takes shape, is they list some principles, right? Which is always kind of a double-edged sword if you're a company, because the second that these principles change over time, people will read far too much into the change than if you would never put anything out originally. But they have these, 6 principles.
It's like Anthropic's Constitution.
Yeah, it's like the Constitution. It's like the "Don't be evil," Google's unofficial motto. So, double-edged sword. The one that really stuck out to me was them saying explicitly that they don't optimize for time spent in ChatGPT. They prioritize user trust and user experience over revenue, which is an interesting bullet, because they are switching to actually a for-profit corporate structure instead of this nonprofit. But like putting this in context, the high-level optimization that Google has always done for search since day one has been they want to get you off of the search results page as quickly as possible. So the success the product teams would be measured against within Google would be if you're given some list of search results, if you click the very first thing and never come back, that is the gold star. if you click on something, come back, click on something else, that's a ding. And the more time that people spend looking for what they want, that speaks to how bad the search results were. So they optimize for a lot of other metrics, but like that was kind of the North Star. If they can get that number down to be as low as possible, they're doing a good job. It's interesting to think through if that really is in ChatGPT's interest. Because on some level, sure, they want you to spend more time in the real world and like optimizing the time on platform isn't really it. But like on the same time spent in ChatGPT is such a proxy for other things that they probably do care about. Is this giving me very useful coding suggestions? Guess what? Like time spent in Codex is kind of a proxy for how useful is this code.
Yep.
Otherwise, I'll switch to another product. Or if you have a therapist via ChatGPT, like you'll probably be spending a lot of time getting therapy. Maybe actually in that case you don't want to optimize for getting off of therapy.
No, but I see what you're saying. Like you want to stay in the ecosystem
That's exactly
as much
right.
as possible.
I don't think it's as obvious to me at the very least that like this user experience and user trust is completely decoupled to time spent in ChatGPT. So I'm flagging this as something that I think is worth keeping our eye on. We'll see what happens. It's one of those things where it almost feels like they're being dragged to this ad situation, and like, what's the saying? You can pull a horse to water, but you can't make it drink kind of a vibe. So like, we'll actually see maybe how far OpenAI goes with these ads, given Sam's personal bias against advertising as this medium. And like, maybe he's reconciled that internally, but like also maybe that's a growing feud within the company, which is reflected by a couple of these researchers leaving in the heels of this ad push. So we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, time will tell.
Time will tell. Well, speaking of OpenAI, they also have some news coming out this week from our favorite Austrian, Peter Steinberger, is joining OpenAI. So we discussed this a little bit last week. Steinberger was the founder or the original inventor of OpenClaw that went through a couple of those renaming pushes. We have a much deeper dive as to OpenClaw that we talked about last week. But with this pseudo acquisition, so let me describe exactly what happened here. Basically, they acquihired Peter, but they didn't acquihire or own the project itself. So the actual OpenClaw is going to live on in a foundation that's dedicated to the improvement, the open source project. But OpenAI now gets direct access to Pete, your friend and mine, as he's going to invent the next generation of consumer agentic systems. So we'll see exactly what this means in the day-to-day. I feel like we've seen a few of these acquihires in the past that have not really gone according to plan. Product end up being shelved or shut down or whatever. But what was astounding to me was just how fast this all happened. It felt a little bit like the acquisition offers that flowed into Clubhouse right during the pandemic, which for those of us who totally forgot that Clubhouse was a thing.
I forgot that they existed, man.
Yes.
That's crazy.
And they got an acquisition offer for, I think, $1 billion from Snapchat or $5 billion from Snapchat. Right when they were riding this cusp of virality, everyone was on them. It seemed like the next big thing. And then they died a few months later. You know what I mean? Richard, is consumer AI having a real moment right now? Do you feel like this is proof of that underlying phenomenon? Or are we just watching a bunch of flash in the pan products get propped up by hype, much like the Clubhouse phenomenon, and these are not going to live on in any serious form?
It's a good question. I mean, look, I think we've talked about how OpenClaw has some fundamental flaws, right? Like particularly the security concerns that we mentioned last time. So OpenClaw, I want to say right off the bat, is not a perfect product. In some sense, it's not really a product at all. Like the model itself is just running an open source version of one of the classic LLMs that we're familiar with. What it is fundamentally a utility for folks that are not particularly technical, but technical enough to be able to interact with these models, to build up for themselves a personalized ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And that feels novel in some sense. So I think what OpenClaw is, it's not a technical innovation. What it is this insight that people really care about personalized AI. I think people really want to live out this dream of having an LLM that is a true personal assistant and has native ability to plug in with all of the tools that they have access to in terms of like their accounts online, things in the physical world, like their smart fridge and their appliances and their phone. And to be able to have this like personalized ecosystem that they fully own, right? And I think that we hadn't fully understood that there was so much demand for that until OpenClaw came along. So I wouldn't think of this as just like another consumer AI product. I would say that this is more a proof of concept for a new paradigm that people are asking for AI to be like a personal assistant. And we talked about this last time already, that this was a big L for companies like Apple, who would have loved to have something like OpenClaw running across all of the Apple devices in a person's ecosystem.
Yeah, they kind of got beat to the punch.
Peter was the first one to really understand that there's a demand for this, to build out this proof of concept. And the fact that it's just taken off like wildfire speaks to the fact that, we need to start thinking about how to create more personalized AIs that are living locally on your, devices, like things that you own personally. And so just to answer your question, I think this is neither. I don't think that this is not just another consumer AI thing. And I don't think that this is just a flash in the pan product. I think that this is a proof of concept for a new type of AI that will be important in the next 2 to 5 years. Personalized AI products that are living on your own devices and not being hosted on some cloud miles away from you.
Access to your data. They can do things on your behalf.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing in what you just said, Rich, that I might push back on a little bit is I don't know if it was the hottest take for the development of OpenClaw for its overall goal. Because like the goal of a personal assistant has been in existence as long as Siri has been a thing. That's what Alexa was trying to do. Like I feel like this has kind of been the panacea of Silicon Valley for a really long time to say, what if everyone could just have a world-class EA in their pocket for free that can do whatever you want? And I guess my hot take here a little bit is that it's the cautiousness of a lot of the big players that stopped them from developing an OpenClaw first. Because Peter started this as an open source project, right? The disclaimer that was kind of on this thing was use it at your own risk. You know what I mean? This is like a developer preview, basically. You still had to install it via CLI. It was a pseudo consumer project, which like we can debate how responsible it is to kind of unleash this into the world. But I think the big labs and like the big companies had so much fodder that they were like, if we're going to develop this, we have to develop it right with the right kind of security.
Yeah, with
safeguards.
the right safety. It has to like flow natively with our existing tools, all this stuff.
100%.
Yeah.
It's like there's too much risk on this for us to roll something like this ourselves. And I think like the OpenClaw thing just converged these themes of most people run these systems anyway unsupervised with like dangerously skip permissions. The systems have gotten good enough that it's probably not going to do any crazy catastrophic RF on your file system. It still could, but that's kind of the risk. And in general, I think that just the big companies were kind of trying to do this properly. So we're slower to this game. And they kind of got beat here in the hype cycle by someone who was like, oh no, in like a rabbit versus the hare, I'm going to be small. I'm going to be the hare. And let's just like go and rip it.
I think you're right. But what I'm saying here is that I think that what Silicon Valley didn't fully understand is that folks like to tinker with their own stuff. And there is this class of developer these days that is proficient enough to be able to understand what these tools are doing, how to set them up in just the right configuration. And they don't want a big company to say, this is your personalized assistant and we've coded it up to interact with all of your accounts. People want to be able to control it all themselves at home as a local first kind of user experience. There's something fun about tinkering with these things and like you own it yourself.
100%.
It's almost like why people will mod a car when they buy it, right? People will buy like a new Porsche and then go into their garage, buy a bunch of parts and like install them, right? Because it's fun. It's like, it gives you ownership over this thing. This is like your thing now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we hadn't realized that when we want personalized assistance, what that means is that it not just has full access to our accounts, but we have had some role in creating this thing to begin with, right? Apple would never have allowed people to tinker with the source code of Siri. That's insane.
Forget about it.
Forget about it, right? But it turns out that when people want a personalized assistant, what they also want to be able to do is really personalize the personalized assistant. Like they want to be able to code and change how it personalizes to their own ecosystem, right? And that I think is something that we hadn't realized. And that, Peter kind of with this fun hobby project tapped into this desire in a way that we hadn't fully realized existed.
100%. I don't think we talked last week about how there was an OpenClaw agent that tried to put up a PR against matplotlib. The maintainers rejected that commit, and then it wrote this hit piece about the maintainers.
It got
for
mad.
gatekeeping.
Totally.
It basically got mad, It's not because the models are sentient, but it's like...
It's pretty human-like, though.
But it is very human-like. And the point being is some of that stuff is objectively bad. We maybe shouldn't let these things run amok, or we're going to have to choose new things that we want to consider if we do. But at the very least, it made for like a weird couple of weeks. And I think that weirdness is like still just emerging. And it's probably just going to get weirder as we're interacting with these things. And I think because of like that alone, people just want to see what happens when they leave these things alone.
I think time will tell fundamentally whether these tools will stick around in the current format. I think there's a good chance that OpenClaw goes through a lot of transformations now that it's maybe not owned by OpenAI, but at least, they get to influence Pete a little bit indirectly.
You think he goes by Pete? You guys buddies?
I don't know. What do you think he would go by? Peter. It seems probably Peter, right?
Oh, true.
The Austrian vibe. Yeah.
Peter.
But I don't know, man. Time will tell. And I'm really curious to see how and whether OpenAI shifts the focus of this project.
Yeah. Puts their finger on the scale. Yeah, we'll see. They just added a board member. So I feel like this is still really hot news. We'll see what ends up happening. The only other thing to flag here, Rich, that I think is kind of interesting, or like maybe a takeaway for me, is how prevalent Twitter or X still is in the cultural zeitgeist. Because, why was it Peter? I was asking myself this question. He's not the first person to try this. He's probably not the first open source maintainer to try this. This was the one that really crossed the cultural chasm. People are buying Mac minis in order to install this. People are learning what GitHub is for the first time in order to install this. It's like, why was it this thing versus everything else that came before it? Is it crazy to suggest that sneaky it's because of Twitter? Like Peter before this started had something like 200, maybe 250,000 followers on his social accounts. He's been hacking around with AI stuff for the last year. I think he's become kind of a thought leader in the space, both on Twitter and his own blog. And like he had this built-in distribution channel when he started this project that people did sign up immediately and give it a shot because of who was behind it. And I think that there has been some sense that maybe the importance of Twitter has been decreasing over time, like post Elon acquisition, there was this big exodus, yada, yada, yada. What's your read? Do you feel like this succeeded because of that distribution channel? Or do you feel like this would have succeeded even if Peter wasn't on Twitter?
It's a good question. I think there's two things. I think that people like Peter's sort of just personality as a whole. I think he tends to be pretty irreverent. And that's corroborated by the fact that, he called it Claude bot and kind of like made fun of Anthropic a little bit. I think there's also a little bit of a fun tension there with Anthropic kind of suing him that kind of added to the mystique of this product.
It's like the Streisand effect,
Yeah, and it just kind of added a special extra spotlight. The fact that Anthropic seemed to kind of like be upset with Peter, and Peter kind of being this irreverent guy seemed to kind of be making fun of them and kind of like throwing some jabs of his own at Anthropic. So I think there's a little bit of that aspect as well, just like the dramatization of the whole thing. But no, I mean, look, man, like we're living in an attention economy, like eyeballs are money these days. Like if you have a following, you can easily trade in that attention, those chips for real money at any point by creating a product. Peter, in some sense, was in this interesting position where he had actually already sold his company for, what was it, like $100 million or something like that? Or he doesn't need more money, right? And clearly, because he doesn't need more money, he doesn't really have to like appease any investors or like try to make a good impression on Anthropic. He can just really be himself, tinker on things that he really cares about. And your chances are, like, if you're not scheming and you're building out something really cool for yourself as a hobby project, that it'll end up probably being better than something that you scheme because you think it'll make you a lot of money, right? But frankly, I think like we were due for something like this to emerge at some point. So I'm not surprised that it was, in 2026 that this really took off. Like this was kind of already overdue IMO.
Okay, Rich. Also in this past week, in addition to the acquisition news, Waymo and DeepMind both published major world model updates. So world model gets back to this idea of having models that can actually generate video as output. So you give it a text prompt and it gives you some world, but it's not just like a Sora generation where it's like one shot. You can actually interact with this model like a video game.
Like a video
walk
game.
around. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's sick.
And specifically what I think was so sick. So Google's is called Project Genie. I think we did a deep dive about this maybe 4 months ago.
We love Genie.
We love Genie. Well, Genie was just so cool because I feel like it was the first one of these world models that didn't rely on generating a 3D environment behind the scenes. It was pixel by pixel, and yet it was able to keep the history of what came before it. So, if you're walking through a forest and you see a log, you turn away, go back, log still.
It has the continuity.
100%.
Yeah.
It's like the most obvious in some ways of like, yeah, that's how the real world works. But that's exactly why it's so cool. It's like, that actually is how the real world works. So Waymo actually made their own model for doing self-driving. So you can prompt it with some scenario, and then it will generate you the outputs of basically what the Waymo car would see in this given situation. Gives you LiDAR information, gives you the video capture of what's around you. Super cool. I think that this plays in for both companies because it's kind of this cheat code potentially to generating data for very low data regimes. Once we've tapped out all of the data that's on the internet, we have very few options to be able to increase the underlying data size that these models
Simulations
are
are so important. We've talked about this before, but simulating data is the new frontier.
I mean, maybe it's worth spending a little bit of time, again, recapping what language models are at a high level. But Richard, when I look at these two releases that both happened within a couple of weeks of each other, it was like this public release of the Project Genie, people can actually play around with it, and the Waymo model for self-driving. Of each of those, I feel like to me, the Project Genie was kind of inevitable. It's like, yeah, of course, someone's going to try to package this up as either a POC or a video game or something. Waymo announcing that they have a world model for cars wasn't like totally something that was in my bingo card for 2026.
Never in my wildest imagination would I have imagined that by 2026, we would have basically solved FSD.
Yeah.
So I recently pulled trig and got a Model Y, right? And I've been playing around with the FSD because it comes with a couple months of FSD. It's so good. It's so good. And it just hadn't occurred to me that the progress would be incremental, and then all of a sudden, like step function. You're driving around a city without having to touch the steering wheel like 99% of the time. And that just all happened so quickly over the last 2 years, Waymo's, Tesla's, like all these other Wave, right? These self-driving companies, like it works. There's a proof of concept. And we're at the stage where now it's just a matter of basically like bringing it to the full market and having everyone have access to this thing, right, all the time. But that's not a big jump anymore.
It's not a technical jump.
It's not a technical jump. It's a business. It's a market kind of thing. Yeah. Exactly. So to me, it felt like the reason why this was a solvable problem was because these cars fundamentally are recording data in real time all the time. You can build a data set of a car driving around, but just recording driving for hours and hours and hours and then training on that. And that's exactly what Waymo did. They just basically trained their models on this car driving around the city of San Francisco and other cities in the US for hundreds of hours. And they were able to build a pretty good policy, like a way for the car to drive itself by using that data. So that made perfect sense to me, right? What I think is the new frontier now for these models is basically to say, look, these cars have been trained on all this real world data, but the issue is that these cars are now so good that the only times that they would catastrophically mess up is in one of these super rare events, something that is so hard to come by that we can't even find the data for it in the real world. But there's a 1 in a trillion chance that this could happen. And if it does happen, hey, guess what? The car's never seen that before and the car will mess up, right? So imagine that like you're driving and all of a sudden like a tiger jumps out of the street and hits the car. When would that ever happen? That's insane, right? When do you ever see a tiger just randomly roaming the streets of San Francisco? Never, right? Maybe a coyote.
Yeah, totally.
But look, man, like maybe, right?
Escapes from the zoo.
Escapes from
San
the
Diego
zoo
a couple years ago.
right?
There was a mountain lion in San Francisco.
Maybe it's possible.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, like it would be really hard for Waymo or for Tesla to collect enough real world data for them to sample or see enough of these super rare events to train that into the model. The only possible solution is to basically synthetically generate world models where the model can drive around in this like synthetic world. And there now, because it's a synthetic world that you control, you can throw all these random events at the model in this synthetic environment. And so you can start doing like really interesting things like what happens if you're driving and there's a tornado on the Golden Gate Bridge, right? Never happened before. Could it happen? Maybe like a 1 in 10 trillion chance that happens, right? But again, like it's a way to make these models more robust. And I don't think that this would have been on my bingo card for 2026 because I wouldn't have thought that FSD would be so good by 2026. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But now that it is so good, this just seems like the next obvious step. I think in my bingo card, this would have been like a 2020, maybe a 2040 kind of thing or a 2050 kind of thing, just because solving FSD felt so hard.
And the generative task is that much harder if you think about it, right?
Exactly.
Because you're not just trying to look in the world and discriminate what you're doing. You're actually trying to say, do I have some cohesive notion of the world that is so realistic that I can generate things that are out of the real world distribution because I know how the puzzle pieces work together. You know what I mean? Like, I know how big an elephant would be if that's crossing the road. I know how gravity works. So I actually can approximate what it's going to look like based on its
Yeah.
body mass. Like,
Yep.
all of these things actually don't really come necessarily from the driving data that it sees day to day, but almost more akin to the YouTube data that it's maybe seen, or like these other facets of physics that it's been able to intuit and then lets you generalize.
Yeah, 100%. I guess like put another way, like in order to build this simulator, this world model, if you can build that world model, you've almost already solved the task. Because in order to build a simulated version of the world, you have to train a model that can simulate the world. How crazy is that? Like, how do you train a model to understand the physics of what it would look like for, I don't know, some crazy thing to happen, like for someone on the 5th floor of their apartment to accidentally throw a bowling ball out the window and for that to land on the street?
Don't try this at home, folks.
I guess I can kind of visualize in my head like what that would look like if
Yeah.
a bowling ball hit the street from having been thrown from a 5-story building. But it's hard, right? And like a model has to understand that as well and has to be trained on that in some way in order to be able to simulate that happening. So I think it's just absolutely crazy the amount of progress we've made in building these world models. And once we can do that, it just seems obvious that their application to building better self-driving cars is the next step.
Yeah, naturally. I mean, I think two cool things here. One is this is maybe the first obvious case of all of Google's properties coming together in a really product first way.
Oh, totally.
Because this Waymo model was built on Genie 3.
Yeah.
Right? It was like
Yeah.
a fine-tuned version of Genie 3 that already used the base knowledge that it had, mostly from YouTube, right? Takes YouTube, has this built-in world model, knows how physics works, and then Waymo took that model and fine-tuned it for the camera and LiDAR data that you would actually see coming out of a car. So it's this very smart play.
And Google Maps was also probably involved in this, all
really
this
good point.
other previous investment, right?
Yeah.
That you could never have predicted how it would like influence their ability to build. You could never have predicted that all of this would eventually go into this like self-driving car package, like
Totally.
this product, right? It's insane. I mean, I think Google here is just really made some good bets back in the day that they had no idea how they would pan out.
Yeah.
Right.
What's this coupling of this like really deep research? I still get the vibe that DeepMind is still focused on bets that probably won't play out in the next year, but maybe more on like the next 4 years from now. They're still very much one of these R&D first labs. But then you also have divisions that are part of Google or like Google subsidiaries like Waymo that can take the outputs of that and do cool things or work with the DeepMind engineers in order to fine tune this for some real world use case. And I think that has shown to be a pretty harmonious pairing thus far of, yes, you have something that's like a base thing, maybe a cool technical demo, and you're actually trying to make that like real world applicable. We're seeing that now for maybe the first or second time within this world model. Also worth calling out is the fact that it does give you LiDAR data as output is just really cool. I mean, on a certain level, it's no more or less hard than doing a regular camera output. It's just a different modality with these point data. But like there is something about just the depth of things that I wouldn't necessarily be able to get from the images alone. But the simulations that you show, like driving on the Golden Gate Bridge covered in light snow, it really does look like the output that you would get from a Waymo if that was a real situation that happened. And I think the cool thing with all this, in addition to what you said, is the fact that you can use this model in addition to human creativity or expertise to come up with some of these situations. Like, I almost think the power of the world model is not just a model that's going to give you more data, but it's a model that lets you inject some notion of what are the biggest risks or what is the rare things that we might experience. It might be weather patterns. It might be exactly what you see on the street. It might be a conflict of a car like coming at you instead of driving the same direction. You can kind of couple this notion of like almost feature engineering, but more like situation engineering into the world model, get those outputs, and then use that as additional training data that you feed back into the underlying system in a way that I think, because it's not zero shot, it like does require you to probe it. That becomes interesting for that reason alone.
Yeah, it's interesting because it feels like this is all true, right? All these world models are doing this crazy simulation of the world. They can like add their own creativity, predict what things might happen in the future, right? It's almost like this predictive engine. The one thing that is almost ironic is that the thing that's now the bottleneck is in not the software, but actually the hardware in some of these models. Like it's in the cameras, for instance, of these cars, where if if it's rainy, they can't see enough. That's where things go awry. But it's almost at the point where the software has outpaced the hardware. And we're in this loop now where the software can model the world in all these really intricate ways. The thing that's the bottleneck is in our ability to actually perceive the world. If you look at these self-driving cars, as soon as there's a little bit of rain, the prediction goes all the way to zero, basically. Like sometimes
which is
FSD
also
will
actually
stop.
why the Waymo windshield wipers turn on
Exactly.
during rain. I have gotten a lot of questions being like, is that for our benefit of passengers in the car? No, it's actually because
It's
the
for the
cameras can't
exactly.
see. Yeah, totally.
And isn't it just so crazy that the model can have this full understanding of the world, can simulate what it would look like for an elephant to walk up the street, for a bowling ball to fall down a 5-story apartment building. But yet, if it's like a little rainy, the car is like, oh, actually, I have like no confidence anymore. So it almost feels like at this point, the hardware is the thing that has to actually meet the level that the software is at for us to be able to have like full FSD,
I
right?
think that's totally right. I mean, that's also true just for the sensor fusion that it's doing at the hardware level. Like full sensor fusion is still a little too slow to be able to be done naively in the car. So there's like these workaround, these heuristics, but the end goal is actually limited based on hardware speeds to be able to take all of these, maybe 1,000 kilohertz signals that are happening at all times, fuse that in one representation, then push forward to a GPU. I think you're right. It's not actually on like the underlying modeling prowess.
And I should say this wasn't the case 10 years ago. Like I remember a couple of years ago, I was working on this robot thing that had a LiDAR built in. And I remember the PI in the lab being like, look, we have this great LiDAR. We invested in it because we think we want to future-proof this robot. Right now, it gives us so much data that we literally don't even know how to model it. Like our model is so bad, we don't know what to do with all this data stream. We've gotten to the point where that's reversed now.
Yeah,
like
really
the
good point,
model
yeah.
itself is so good. It's asking for more data. We just can't feed it enough because the hardware we have is so limited by the environment and can just get clogged up and can easily mess up, right? So it's a fun new world we're living in where fundamentally like these models have gotten so much better than our ability to perceive the physical world. I wonder if in the future we'll have to start investing much more in hardware and stop focusing as much on the actual foundational like modeling tools we have, because we will have cracked world modeling at that point. And the thing that's missing is then our ability to actually incorporate those into the physical world via hardware.
Okay, Rich, we just published an episode on YouTube.
It was crazy.
Special YouTube short. It was crazy.
It was so good.
We actually just did it live. And then we're going to exclude from this podcast because you kind of have to see it to believe it, or maybe see it to not believe it. So it's up on YouTube. Check it out. Our first impressions are as follows, but you can see the full thing on YouTube.
Our first impressions are it's not worth $200, but it's pretty good, man. Like for what it is, like it clearly shows that this is possible. I think with all of these proof of concepts, the most important thing is to deliver on not just the model, but also on the user experience. I'm a big user experience guy at this point.
Yes, you are. Famous for it.
In another world, I'd love to be a designer. And I think that this user experience is actually like pretty convincing. And I actually buy it. I think that this could be something that people actually use to design video games, to like just play around, like design like a movie, or like create a clip of something. Like it works. It works to like a surprising extent. Now, is the model itself good? No, it's not quite there yet.
It's good, not great.
It's good, not great.
Yeah.
And I think the user experience that they've built into it is actually, I think, the right one. It's cool that they give you basically the ability to access the whole world. Like you can move around, you can jump, you can look around, you can put yourself in the point of view of the character that you created, or you can have a third eye kind of like tracking camera view. It's all really good. It's all really neat. It just doesn't really work that well yet.
100%.
Yeah.
Cool, Rich. Changing continents, not just companies, but continents. Mistral, which is kind of the European frontier AI lab, released Voxtral this past week, which is a new speech transcription system that challenges Whisper. Whisper itself, this OpenAI project, was first released a few years ago now, and has basically been the de facto way that people have been doing speech to text ever since, even though there certainly are challengers. But it's free, it's open source, you can deploy in your own cloud, and the OpenAI prices for it are super cheap. So it's just kind of default. Voxtral is going at that with a pretty clear play, where it has both a batch API that you can call on their servers, that's close weights, and a 4 billion parameter open weights model that's designed for real-time use. So low enough memory that you could put it on a cell phone or something, and you can actually interact with it within some third-party app. With this release, Mistral is adding yet another modality to their portfolio of models. I feel like typically they're more of a language model company. This is a foray into speech. Do you feel like them building their own transcription model signals strategic depth as a frontier lab competitor? Or is this a company that's just spreading itself too thin?
What I would say is that exploring with different modalities can only ever be good. I think models these days, the more multimodal they are, the more multimodal native they are, the better they tend to be. And you see this with a lot of the Chinese labs, right? Those models tend to be multimodal first. And I think that's kind of the right move, man. I think these days, say you create an embedding model. You don't just want a text embedding model. You want to be able to automatically embed, images, voice, videos even. Like, why not experiment with different modalities? And I think that this is probably the right call for Mistral at this point, especially given the fact that I think they do have to start making more money. I don't know what their finances look like, but my sense is that Mistral has been lagging behind a little bit, behind some of the more frontier US-based models and labs. So I think that this is probably a good competitive edge that they're trying to carve out for themselves here.
Yeah, I think maybe I have a slightly different view on this, which is I do think that there is a shiny object bias that you can get while working for some of these frontier labs. And one thing that Anthropic has done really well within the past few years, I think, is they focus only on this LLM use case, and everything else is kind of subservient to that. If Anthropic has a world model internally, or if they have some speech text model, that's purely for the purposes of furthering the performance of their LLMs. And like that becomes the product that they're actually selling. I feel like what you kind of end up seeing with some of these other companies that just throw out whatever. Like at this point, OpenAI has a browser. It has all these different modalities. It definitely has ChatGPT. It's got the separate research agent. Like it can pull your team in so many different directions.
Yeah.
I think that especially if you're a small company like Mistral still is, I do worry a little bit that they might compromise the objective that they have to become a really good language modeling provider by bridging out into these other areas. I was kind of curious reading into some of this. Do you think that this maybe is more strategic internally for them, where they actually are trying to use this to bootstrap transcription data from videos? Because I think
interesting.
I think if that's what they're trying to do, then like maybe I could see more of a compelling business pitch for it, that they develop this thing to try to improve the accuracy of systems that are downstream of video transcription, but aren't actually the transcripts themselves. Because as just like a corporate product that they're putting out, it seems a little random for them to be doing.
I mean, I suppose, but like, fundamentally, like image models, speech models, language models, they're all the same architecture, basically, unless you're playing around with some really cutting edge stuff. Chances are that this is just the existing model that they already use for their normal Mistral, or their Mixtral, better said, just now adapted to speech. And I think that, it's not like you have to hire speech specialists to work on this model. You can have the existing team.
Well, I think you kind of do is the bit. Like my impression is speech is actually one of those modalities like pretty hard to cross learn if you're not from the speech world, because so many of the ways we encode speech are not just like taking raw waveform data, but you have to somehow turn that into tokens to plug into a transformer architecture. And that's where a lot of the research ends up being. It's like there's the codebook strategy. You could have Fourier transform compression, feed that in. But like a lot of that I think actually is still kind of speech specific.
The pipeline that you're saying, going from sine and cosine waves to some embedding of those representations, that's an electrical engineering problem. That is an audio processing problem. And you're right. That is something that people are researching. But I think we have a set of tools that we use that are very conventional, sort of like pipelining tools that we use to convert speech into tokens.
Basically things that are like good enough.
These are all good enough. And the one that I have used in the past just basically uses like the Fourier transform of these signals, and you basically get something out known as the Mel-Sepstral coefficients. And those are basically just individual numbers that you can plug into a transformer like any other number, right? And so you're right. I mean, maybe they hired an electrical engineer who specializes in audio processing and, built a new bespoke pipeline. That I think would be a mistake, right? That probably doesn't make that much sense for them to do. But I think that working with multimodal models is going to be the right approach going forward in the future, especially if you haven't carved out a strategic niche for yourself as a company. I think the spray and pray approach, if you are one of these neolabs, is maybe the right one at this point. But here's the thing. I think that Mistral has a much clearer business model that they haven't really been pursuing very clearly, and which is they are the European language model. Why not specialize on European languages and make it the default model for Spanish, for German, for Italian, for Czech? I feel like that is kind of the thing that I thought Mistral was going to do. I thought that they were going to be the most GDPR compliant, most privacy preserving, most multilingual, multi-international model out there. And I know that they are presenting themselves a little bit like this, but I've actually seen them more take the stance of we are the French model. You know what I mean? We are le chat, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're really good for French businesses. We sell to all the big B2B French LLMs. Those are all backed by us fundamentally.
Because they're based in Paris.
Because they're based in Paris. They are very much French first. And I get it. It makes sense. They were founded in France, but I think there still is some play here to be the European model, the model that was developed in the EU that serves the Moldovan customer base and the Slovenian customer base and the Croatian customer base.
Pan-European.
This pan-European, make a model that, is the model that is used by all 30 million folks who live in Croatia, that maybe isn't a big enough customer base for someone like Chat or Anthropic to really go after. But if you're based in Europe and you have access to these markets kind of natively, why not tap into that,
Well, so the interesting bit about that's a little surprising is that they usually segment these speech to text models based on the language that is spoken within the training data set. So if you look at the overall metrics of how Voxtral is performing against Whisper, and this is Whisper large V3, within this multilingual corpus called FLURS, Voxtral is at basically 4% error. And Whisper's at 10%, which sounds like, oh my God, this is a model that's twice as good or less than twice as bad, maybe is a better way to think about it, as the Whisper set of models, which kind of loses the fact that there is such differing ranges of performance across the different languages themselves. So specifically for this Voxtral model, the word error rate within Italian is the lowest of all of these categories. That's at 4.4. Spanish is the next lowest at 4.6. English, 5.9, and French is all the way back at 8.0, which is kind of interesting that as a company that I agree brands itself as this French first company, French actually is not the best performing language within this model, not even close to it. It's all of these other languages, including some of the Germanic ones.
So fun fact, I actually don't think that that's surprising at all because we've actually, if you look at historically, our speech to text models, those have always performed really well on some of the base Romance languages like Spanish and Italian. And there's a bunch of different reasons for this, but it kind of boils down to the fact that these languages are syllable aligned languages. So basically, in language processing, there's this notion of a morpheme. And we've talked about this before on the show, but a morpheme is basically the base unit of a word that carries some sort of meaning. So for instance, a morpheme in the English language might be the ed past participle. So I walked. Walk is a morpheme, and ed by itself is another morpheme. So ed here conveys the fact that walk was in the past tense. So every language has the ability to be morphemized. So you can convert, words in any language to morphemes in that language. But here's the kicker. Some languages are more morphologically rich. They just contain more of these morphemes. And it's especially languages in a class of languages known as agglutinative languages that have a ton of morphemes. The more morphemes you have in your language, the more difficult it is to model that language, especially if you're measuring it at the level of word error rate. So word error rate is this thing that basically measures when you're reproducing a sequence of text, how many of those morphemes did you get right? Did you reproduce effectively? How many of those did you accidentally delete? or falsely add in is also measured into that metric, right? So it's this way of saying basically, are you able to reproduce the original text correctly? And if you have a morphologically rich language like Turkish or even like German, like a lot of the Germanic languages are also like this, it's just harder to do well on that metric, just by definition of how the language is structured. English tends to be pretty easy. And especially for speech models, languages where the intonations align with the syllables, those also tend to be fairly easy. And so Spanish, I think, is actually notoriously easy, right, in parentheses, because it does tend to be like kind of like the morphemes align very nicely with the syllable intonations of the language, which makes it easy for the model to basically look at like pauses in the speech and say, okay, well, this has to be a morpheme. This has to be a morpheme. But just by the nature of the intonation and kind of like I suppose like maybe even like the prosody, like how something is said, aligns very nicely with the morphemes in Spanish and Italian. So for the last 15 years, ever since we've had these models, Italian, Spanish, English tend to like have very low error rates. So models tend to be pretty good on those. And on languages like Arabic, for instance, or like Turkish, we've actually struggled much more. So this isn't a new finding. I also want to say that when we say this thing has a certain word error rate, it's really hard to make progress on word error rates in the same way that we're making progress on some of these language understanding tasks. And fundamentally, that's because like these word error rate metrics are pretty punishing. Like you really can't mess up ever. Otherwise, that metric goes up substantially. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that. But the point is basically, if you've looked at the best word error rate on English in 2015, I think it was like 6% maybe or 5%. And now it's like 4%, right? We've made like a very small improvement.
And that, the minutia of 0.1 actually can make quite a bit of difference because it's compounded over this whole body of corpus versus we usually don't really think about loss or perplexity for a language model in the same kind of way. Yeah, you're right. It's more forgiving.
Exactly.
The only other thing that I'll flag that I thought was kind of cool with this real-time model that you can actually explore the weights of. So this 4 billion parameter model, people have gotten this working on, local MacBooks or iPhones. And the way that they train this model gives it a configurable delay, because when you're thinking about this real-time use case for use, maybe you're doing some phone call agent that's going to receive things. You want it to be able to transcribe people's text in real time very, very quickly so that then you can generate the response as quickly as possible. So like this is kind of the blocking thing in your pipeline for what you're going to do to respond to the user next. You have to understand what they're saying. So you usually will want delay to be as low as possible. But that also kind of means that you have less data to work with, potentially because you're actually spending less time on the compute side of things. But also it could be that you just have less of a window that you're actually trying to process as part of this. So this real-time model actually has a configurable delay where you can choose how long you want to wait after the user speaking, either from sub 200 milliseconds to up to 2.4 seconds. And there's a trade-off at each range here. We're at 480 milliseconds. It basically matches Whisper's performance. So if you give it a little bit more time, it'll hit Whisper. And if you give it a lot more time, like 2.4 seconds, then it will match its own cloud-based batch model, with ostensibly as a larger model, kind of intended more for this offline compute purpose. So it's kind of cool to see models have this configurable threshold, almost like how we can choose how many thinking tokens to use for some tasks. This is kind of like saying we're doing the same thing except for speech models to try to make it either go quicker or go slower. And then there's an accuracy trade-off associated with that.
Totally.
Cool, Rich. Keeping on the model dropping game, 2 big releases this past week, GPT 5.3 Codex and Anthropic's Opus, both launched within 30 minutes of each other on February 5th. Almost like they were planning this thing behind the scenes.
It's a conspiracy.
Is that the new conspiracy?
I know, right?
It's the model labs. Maybe. I'm sure someone's had that. We wouldn't be the first. It feels like this AI lab release cadence has been intensifying all year now. And both products, like both point releases, are kind of positioning around the same thesis, which is long-running autonomous jobs that don't need human babysitting. This particular 30-minute cadence is one of the more intense one-upping of another lab that we've seen so far. You just can't let your competitors have a news cycle by themselves. You always have to beat them to it. My own sense, also for what it's worth, is that these were probably both just early checkpoints of some larger training run that they have going, but they're time constrained with it. You can only speed these things up so much. So the OpenAI one probably came from GPT-6 or maybe GPT-5.5, and the Anthropic Opus probably came from Opus 5. They just pre-released these to get ahead of the competitors. Rich, do you feel like because these releases are just this like incremental gains, or maybe even early checkpoints from this other model, like it's worth discussing in and of itself? Or are we slowly starting to walk to more of this cadence where model launches have just lost some of their meaning because they're ever changing and ever improving, and maybe that's just an implementation detail?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think nowadays when we have a model launch, I think a little bit of the excitement is lost. I think when we first were expecting GPT-5 to come out, do you remember how much excitement there was where people were saying, oh man, this is going to be AGI this time, right? And you would have employees saying, oh my God, like this is really going to revolutionize everything. And Sam was saying, like, we've hit AGI, right? There was this like excitement and like unknown aspect to what the model was going to have. What is the quality of this model? Is this really going to replace my job? I think at this point, we've lost some of that initial excitement and maybe fear whenever there's a model launch, because we understand that these really now are incremental improvements. What I think has sped up though is this kind of like Cold War-esque style race to always having the slightly better model. And it's an absolutely like punishing pace at which these models are released at. You know, it always feels as one of these frontier labs, you can't have the worst model. You always need to, on some benchmarks, be the best, right? And so it's funny because it almost seems like Anthropic and OpenAI both have a stockpile of kind of like checkpoints ready, you know, just to be released. But they only want to release them
like at the hint that your competitor is going to drop something
else. There's
else.
like a big red button and there's like a guy that you call when the other person has released something. Yeah, and you're like, Sven, do it now. And Sven's like, okay, and like presses, and then the model gets deployed, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's almost like the opposite of this like Apple mentality, which is like only release something when it's ready, where it feels like the fundamentally like this isn't a consumer product in the same way that like a hardware product is. This is one of these products where consumers, frankly, oftentimes don't even realize the differences between these models. It's only on these made up benchmarks that some of these models might be better than others. And so releasing a new checkpoint or releasing a new model doesn't really mean that much for us day to day. What in some sense like matters more is the user experience of these models. And that hasn't really changed at all, other than modulo, like some of these, you know, UI projects that Claude is working on, like Cowork and these sorts of things. But, you know, I don't think the model launch really means what it used to mean anymore.
Yeah, I think I typically agree. I think it's interesting. Users obviously have some affinity to some models versus the others.
Yeah.
I got a question the other day if I missed any model, which I thought was kind of an interesting question, you know, as like a cocktail party topic of discussion. It's like, you know, what model went too soon, Rich? You know what I mean? And it's like, you know, this notion that people have emotional affinity to one model or the other. I think personally, I see them a little bit more as instruments just to do something. Like I want to spend as little time on chat or Claude as possible.
Yeah.
But like I know people really missed, what was it, 4.0, the like really emotive model that they had to bring back for a little while. So like it is weird to me. It's like I think because you're changing the weights of these models, and we have kind of been in this paradigm where things are set to feature releases already. Like you can call this model by its name and it probably has different properties from another one. It's a little bit different from conventional software versioning, where you anticipate that the next version that's released is going to have all the same features as the current one and more. It's just going to be like absolutely better or like a larger scope. Models are kind of this weird hybrid where that's really not guaranteed to be the case. Like it's guaranteed that the behavior is going to be at least like minutely different in the next model than what you're used to, because the weight matrices have updated across the board. So yeah, it's I honestly don't know where this is headed, other than maybe in some steady state we just lose some of our attachment to one model over the other and we start getting more into this like continuous deployment paradigm. I think until we literally don't know what model version is running behind the scenes anymore, we're probably going to have very strong opinions and very like buzzy release cycles of people that really are trying to push one model versus the other, because that also encourages people to switch back to it when maybe they've been off.
I will say though, I am probably the least loyal customer to any of these models. If I compare my behavior to my relationship to Apple, right, it would be so hard to switch, right? These models, like it's trivial, you know what I mean? You just have Codex, you have Claude, Bod, like it's not a big deal. Like you just kind of spin up whatever is currently the best you think, or maybe you'll try out like 2 or 3 things at the same time. Like it's this class of product is fundamentally not what you would call in economics like a sticky product. You know what I mean? It's the most like substitutable, I suppose, of any product I've ever used.
Yeah, perhaps.
Exactly. You know, so It's a tough industry to be in. I would hate to be in the business side of things at Anthropic or OpenAI, because these goods are all like fungible, I suppose. Like they're all like fundamentally interchangeable. I mean, it makes sense that like we've gotten to the point where the only economical correct decision, like from a game theoretic standpoint, is for models to all be released at the exact same date.
Totally.
If you were to like compute like the equilibrium point, what we're converging to is like all models aren't released until one guy releases a model, and then in the next 5 minutes, they're all released.
It all cascades.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think that's right. Because really what you're trying to prevent in what you just said is people trying other models. I think the second that people think that what they're using might not be optimal, they'll do a new survey of the landscape to see what's new out there. So I think it's really important for it to feel, not the reality, but just the feeling that your users that you're serving are getting a state-of-the-art model, if not the state-of-the-art model at all times. Because I think the second that you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile and you might lose a customer.
Totally. And so maybe what this converges to is everyone releases a model every day. There's a new checkpoint,
Yeah, totally.
Because if you're just dumping out a checkpoint, you're continuously learning. Like, why not release a new model? At that point, the naming is going to be absolutely horrendous, obviously. But maybe that's the right thing to do.
Claude Opus, February 16th, 2026.
Yeah. I mean,
2 p.m.
At that point, you as a user don't even want to see the model name anymore.
No, for sure.
Like, who cares?
Yeah.
It's just the new one, the one that dropped today.
The best.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. Well, Rich, I think that's a pretty good note to end on.
Hey, man. Well, which one do you prefer, Codex or Opus?
I'm using Codex as my daily driver right now. I think they're both good. Codex is... I find it does a little bit more deep thinking before trying to solve a problem. It'll explore more files. It'll like really burn some reasoning tokens, especially when you turn on the extra high. Opus I try to right size because I have subscriptions to both. I try to right size for things that I think are easy enough that Opus will get right because Opus ends up being way faster.
Yeah, I think that's true. I need to play with both, honestly. I mean, I've heard great things about Codex, so maybe I'll try that out after this pod.
Yeah. Well, let us know what you think.
Hell yeah, we'll do it.
Good, man. And I think in next episode, we're talking about some Neo Labs.
So
we're continuing the battle of the AI companies.
Exactly.
And we'll see what they're up to. I personally am very curious because there are trillions of dollars worth of capital funding tied up in these guys. So hope they're doing something.
Well, I'll fill you in next time, boys.
Yeah, sounds good, man.
All right, man.
Later.
Bye.
I remember applying to a place with 2 friends, and we had this place right on Divisadero. It was incredible. It had this rooftop, right number of rooms, great light. I was just like, hey, we're different. We're not like the other guys.
We're not like the other 3 guys.
No, totally. We're super sweet. We have just conservative tech jobs. So this whole story wraps around because my roommate then, Ruse, is scrolling TikTok and he's like, oh my God, this house looks super familiar. So it was during Fleet Week. The renters of the new building that ended up getting the spot hosted themselves a Fleet Week party that got totally out of control and posted on TikTok. To which I said, my man, we promised you we wouldn't do this.
They wanted parties. I think that's where you went wrong.
We needed to guarantee parties.
Exactly.
Yeah, maybe this guy was just trying to function.
He was just trying to have a good time. And he was like, who are these narcs who haven't heard of like parties?
Totally. Yeah, totally.